Elara Vance did not believe in ghosts, but she believed fiercely in thermodynamics and structural decay. At 2:47 a.m., these two pillars of her reality felt flimsy in Blackwood Manor. The house, slated for demolition in 3 weeks, was less a structure and more a monumental, dusty lung, inhaling and exhaling the dry, cold air of late autumn. Elara, an architectural historian specializing in pre-WWI domestic systems, was supposed to be documenting the relics: the dumbwaiter shaft, the coal chutes, the impossibly ornate ventilation system. Her current focus was the servants' hall, a subterranean mausoleum of duty and resentment. It was here, amongst the overturned wooden benches and the skeletal remains of a cast-iron stove, that the centerpiece of her professional obsession lay: the servant call system. It was a magnificent apparatus, almost a meter wide, mounted to a wall blackened by a century of soot and, more specifically, the 1879 fire that had sealed the manor's fate. The panel was brass and mahogany, dotted with a dozen small, numbered levers, each connected by unseen wires to a delicate, finger-sized brass bell mechanism housed within the box. Its purpose was simple. When Lord Blackwood, in the master bedroom bell 7, pulled his cord, the lever on the panel dropped, and its corresponding bell dinged, signaling the servant on duty. Now, the levers were static, the brass dull with neglect, the internal mechanisms rusted solid. The wires, Elara had confirmed, had long ago frayed and been cut during a 1930s remodeling attempt. It was inert, a beautiful corpse of technology. She was sitting at a folding military-style table she'd set up, illuminated by a single, harsh LED lamp that did little more than push back the overwhelming shadows. She was cross-referencing a microfiche image of the original 1879 floor plan with her high-resolution laser scans. The only sounds were the soft, rhythmic click of her keyboard and the distant, agonizing thud of a loose gutter outside, a sound that always managed to settle her nerves because it was real. It was physics, metal, wind, gravity. Then came the deviation. Not a creak, not a groan of old wood, but something deliberate, something composed. A knock. It was heavy. 3 distinct impacts, thud, 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 on the massive oak front door, located 3 floors and 90 meters away, at the very end of the main gallery. Elara froze, her fingers hovering over the M key. The sound was impossible. The door was chained, barred, and sealed by her own padlock. More importantly, she was alone. The security crew had checked her in 12 hours ago and wouldn't return until sunrise. She held her breath, listening. The house responded only with its profound silence, a silence that felt heavier than the weight of the roof. Wind, she whispered to the dust motes, dancing in the LED beam. Pressure differential. She tried to return to her work, focusing on the minute measurements of the scullery door jamb bell 9 on the panel. Her mind, however, was now a hollow drum, waiting for the next beat. She lasted another 15 minutes, cataloging the strange, small indentations on the wooden floor near the call. Panel footsteps, perhaps, worn into the floor over 50 years of servants standing in the same spot. It was 2:59 a.m. Then, the first impossible detail occurred. The servant call system, the disconnected, rusted, inert centerpiece of her research, moved. It wasn't a flicker. It wasn't a hallucination induced by fatigue. It was a precise, undeniable action. The lever corresponding to bell 7, the master bedroom, snapped downward. It moved with the quick, decisive clack of well-oiled machinery, a sound that should not exist in this abandoned, dry place. Simultaneously, the small brass bell within the panel's housing emitted a soft, high-pitched, yet utterly clear DNG. Elara's heart did not pound. It stopped, a frozen, dense knot in her chest. Every logical circuit in her mind shorted out, leaving behind a cold, pure channel of terror. She stared at the panel. The lever 47 was fully depressed. The small, circular nameplate next to it, a faded piece of ivory with Master B etched in looping script now, tilted dot. She pushed back from the table, scraping the metal legs across the floor. She approached the panel slowly, reaching out a trembling hand. The brass was cold, colder than the rest of the metal, impossibly cold, as if it had been submerged in ice. She grasped the small wooden knob of the lever and tried to pull it back up, to reset the signal. It wouldn't budge. It was jammed solid, stuck in the called position. The mechanism felt rigid, locked by an internal pressure that defied her considerable strength. She snatched up her phone, her fingers fumbling over the screen. She needed a photograph, proof. The phone screen flared to life, illuminating the dust-filled air. The time, displayed in the corner of the screen, punched a new, deeper hole into her remaining composure. 3 a.m. 3 a.m. The time was too clean, too precise. She knew, instantly, that the initial knock had been a preamble, a theatrical curtain opening for this scheduled terror. Logic returned, but it was corrupted, twisted to explain the supernatural. Residual magnetic field, a tiny thermal contraction caused by the LED lamp. No explanation existed for the sharp, mechanical clack and the perfectly preserved ding of a bell whose wire had been severed over a century ago, driven by a desperate, intellectual curiosity that momentarily eclipsed her fear. She raced back to her table and grabbed the heavy leather-bound staff duties ledger. She had dismissed it earlier as a relic of housekeeping trivia. She flipped through the brittle, yellowed pages, her eyes scanning the neat, spidery cursive under the column labeled, "Night duties, 12 o'clock. M. Says M." She found the entry for 3 a.m. 3 a.m. Lord B summons night, valet bell, 7. Valet attends to fire, checks security, delivers water carafe. A perfect match. The system wasn't malfunctioning. It was operating. It was adhering to a schedule that had been irrelevant for 146 years. Elara felt the chill from the brass. Lever spread into her hand, up her arm, and into her mind. This wasn't a general haunt. This was a routine. This house was playing back its final hours, and she was trapped in the audience. She forced herself to breathe, cold air burning her throat. If it's a schedule, I know what happens next. She scanned the ledger for 3:05 a.m. 3:05 a.m. Bell for kitchen, cook. Late snack requested for Master B housekeeper, confirmed supply. Her eyes flicked to the panel. Bell 4 was labeled cook's pantry. Elara stood motionless, a statue in the beam of the LED, counting the seconds in her head, the clock ticking towards the next scheduled, impossible event. She could leave. She could run, grab her bag, and sprint for the front door, break her own padlock, and not look back. But the academic in her, the part that lived for the anomaly, was transfixed by the impending data point. If 3:05 a.m. passes, and nothing happens, the first one was a coincidence. But she knew, with the primal certainty of a hunted animal, that it would not be a coincidence. The 4 minutes crawled by, each second a stone dropped into a deep well. The silence of the manor, previously vast and empty, now felt pressurized, packed with unseen presence. Elara could hear the frantic rhythm of her own blood echoing in her ears. At precisely 3:05 a.m., the second lever moved. It was louder this time, a more forceful clack. Bell 4, cook's pantry. The ding was deeper, richer, a different timbre of brass than Bell 7. The lever was depressed, the brass now shining wetly under the LED light, the cold radiating outward. Elara did not move. She felt as though her feet had been cemented to the dusty floor. 2 impossible events, following a prescribed, century-old timeline. This was not a glitch. It was a performance. She looked at her phone again. 3:05 a.m. The display was perfectly normal. But something about the digital precision felt wrong, as if the device itself were an intruder in this ancient, mechanical terror. Her eyes drifted to the next entry in the ledger. 3:07 a.m. Bell 9 scullery. Urgent request for cleaning materials to Master Suite Bell 7. Urgent. The word was written in a slightly hurried hand, a deviation from the calm, procedural tone of the previous entries. Something had shifted in 1879. The schedule was beginning to fray. Elara's breath hitched. She finally moved, pulling her bag over her shoulder, the movement slow and difficult, like wading through thick water. Her mind was screaming at her to flee, but her body was tethered by a terrible new understanding. The terror was not static, it was dynamic. It was playing out a scene, and she was in the theater, as she fumbled for the keys to the storage closet, her only supposed haven in the house. She caught her reflection in the glass of a dusty wall clock hanging crookedly above the stove. It was an old, pendulum-style clock, its glass face cracked, its hands frozen at 12 o'clock. She saw herself, pale, hair askew, eyes wide and black in the harsh light. She looked away, her heart hammering, and then looked back, because an impossible detail had just occurred. Her reflection in the cracked glass had not moved the second time she looked. It was still staring at the spot where the clock hung, but Elara herself was now looking at the door. Her reflection hadn't followed her movement. She blinked rapidly, shaking her head. Fatigue, light, dust. But when she looked again, the reflection in the glass blinked. It was a slow, distinct, wrong blink. And then, seamlessly, her reflection tracked her, catching up to her current stance. The dread became profound, a physical weight pressing down on her lungs. It wasn't just the house repeating history. The house was aware of her presence within that history. The impossible reflection was a crack in time, suggesting the audience and the actors were merging. She managed to unlock the storage closet and step inside, pulling the heavy splintered door shut with a loud KR1CH. She didn't lock it. She just leaned against it, sinking to the cold, concrete floor, pulling her knees to her chest. The small, dark space, a repurposed coal Biniford. No actual protection, but the simple act of putting a thin layer of wood between herself and the servant call system felt like survival. She checked her phone again. 3:06 a.m. 60 seconds until bell 9. She didn't need to be outside the room. She just needed the performance to end. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the reality of the manor, focusing on the simple, verifiable truth of the LED light cutting through the absolute dark. She focused on the feeling of the cement beneath her fingers, the hard fact of the wood against her back. 3:07. The clang of bell 9 was violent, a sharp, angry sound that ripped through the wood of the closet door and reverberated through her bones. It was a panicked signal, demanding immediate attention. Elara stifled a gasp, pressing her hands over her mouth to prevent any sound from escaping. The lever for 9 was down. She pulled the ledger closer, its dry leather scent filling the small closet. She was now reading the story of a crisis in real time. The urgency, the shift from routine to panic, was palpable in the entries. The valet summoned, the cook called for a snack, the scullery summoned for urgent cleaning supplies. The schedule continued, escalating with terrifying precision. 3:08 a.m. Bell 5, housekeeper's parlor. Housekeeper called to master suite. Unclear purpose. 3:09 a.m. Bell to butler's office. Butler called to scullery. Bell 9. This wasn't just noise, it was narrative. The house was building towards its climax, and Elara knew the ending. Fire, death, and silence. But the terror was in the anticipation. The knowledge that the last sound she would hear before the house reset its silence would be the chaotic clang of the final. Desperate alarms. She glanced at her phone's display again. The cold, clinical glow of 3:08 a.m. shining in the darkness. She heard a different sound now, closer, softer, and far more insidious than the mechanical bell. It was the whisper of heavy fabric sliding across the dusty floor, a sound that suggested the passage of a body. She held her breath, listening to the impossible footsteps moving just outside the closet door. They were slow, dragging steps, the sound of an overburdened servant rushing toward their duty, an echo of 1879 brought back by the insistent call of bell 5. The footsteps paused right outside her door, and Elara felt the wood vibrate faintly beneath her cheek. She heard the housekeeper's bell 5 ring with a brief, sharp, authoritative dong. The footsteps moved away again, heavier this time, ascending the creaking servant's staircase. The sound of duty being answered, a historical echo moving through the air around her. Elara realized she had just experienced something moving in 3 dimensions, something physical enough to displace dust and press against wood. Her initial disbelief shattered, replaced by a cold, sharp horror. It wasn't a loop playing on a speaker. It was the reenactment of an event, and she was hiding in the coal bin while the players passed by. The fact that the entity had not acknowledged her hiding place was worse than confrontation. It meant she was irrelevant, just scenery in a performance designed for a different, long-dead audience. 3:09 a.m. Bell 2 was next. The butler Elara pressed her cheek against the cold concrete. The sound of the servant climbing the stairs faded into the profound, dust-laden silence. She focused entirely on the metallic relic just outside her fragile wooden barrier, waiting for the clack that would confirm the next step of the historical tragedy. She was no longer documenting the house. She was documenting a haunting, a systematic, scheduled terror that proved, without a doubt, that not all events vanish when the people leave. Some are merely paused, waiting for an observer to press play. She closed her eyes again, hoping that when she opened them, the clock would read 6 a.m., and the nightmare would be over. The house, however, had its own schedule, and the most critical part of the play was yet to come. She knew, with a fatalistic certainty, that she was in too deep to simply walk away. She had to see the final bell ring. She had to know what happened at 3:12 a.m. The compulsion was no longer curiosity. It was an unbearable, chilling obligation to witness. The next entry in the ledger, after bell 2, was only marked with a question mark and a deeply smudged ink blot, sign of the chaos that followed. The unanswered question was the only thing keeping her rooted to the spot. She had to know what the smudged entry meant, and she suspected the house was about to show her. Her fingers traced the faint, almost invisible lines of the ledger's binding. The cold had permeated the small closet, and she shivered, not just from the temperature, but from the realization that she had allowed the environment to dictate her reality. The clock on her phone advanced to 3:09 a.m., and the metallic sound of bell 2. Butler's office echoed with a low, insistent clank. The lever dropped. The play continued. Her breath hitched, anticipating the moment she'd become fully immersed in the house's tragic loop. Elara returned the following night, not out of duty, but out of a terrible, addictive compulsion. The previous night's terror had been replaced by a clinical, desperate hunger for verification. She had spent the daylight hours meticulously researching the 1879 Blackwood fire, finding conflicting reports but confirming the time of detection, 3:15 a.m., the 3 minutes between 3:12 a.m. and the official alarm were a black hole, and the house held the key. Her professional skepticism had been weaponized. She needed to analyze the anomaly, not escape it. She bypassed the closet, setting up her equipment high-sensitivity microphones, thermal imaging cameras, and a dedicated high-speed camera focused solely on the servant call system right in the center of the servants' hall. She felt like a scientist in a cage, observing a dangerous, predictable animal. Her normal was now the rigorous adherence to the schedule of the dead. She knew that bell 7, the master, would ring at 3 a.m., and she was ready. She even had a copy of the ledger open on her tablet, waiting for the first clack. When it came, the sound was muted on the tablet, but overwhelming in the room. 3 a.m., bell 7, clack, ding. Elara flinched, but quickly steadied herself. She checked her equipment. The high-speed camera had captured the lever's descent perfectly. The microphones recorded the bell's clear resonance, and the thermal camera showed a brief, localized spike of heat radiating from the brass lever. The cold was still there, but it was preceded by a quick burst of internal friction, the mechanical action of the lever being pulled. This was not a ghost. It was a mechanism being used. The terrifying question shifted from how to, by whom. The sequence of the previous night repeated with chilling fidelity. Bell for cook at 3:05 a.m. Bell 9 scullery, urgent at 3:07 a.m. Bell 5 housekeeper at 3:08 a.m. and bell to butler at 3:09 a.m. Each metallic sound was a hammer blow to Elara's sanity, confirming the house was a clockwork mechanism of grief and duty. The pattern of horror began to deepen when the sequence hit 3:10 a.m. Elara checked the ledger entry for this. Time, 3:10 a.m. Bell, 10 nursery. Request for governess. Possible illness, distress. Bell 10, the nursery. The lever for 10 snapped down. The ding of its small brass bell, delicate and thin, a desperate, childish sound. As the sound faded, a wave of profound, cold misery washed over Elara. It wasn't the temperature of the brass. It was an emotional resonance that felt violently intrusive. She dropped her tablet, clutching her stomach as a memory, sharp and unwanted, surged into her mind. Elara, age 6, in her bedroom, terrified by a sudden thunderstorm that had killed the power. She was alone, tucked into her bed, the shadows of the room dancing like demons. She had cried out for her mother, but her mother, a brilliant, distant trauma surgeon, had been on call. Elara had screamed for hours until her voice was hoarse and dry, completely unheard, completely alone in the dark. The bell 10 was the sound of a child calling for help in the dark, a plea that went unanswered. Elara saw herself in the small, historical tragedy. Her own childhood trauma suddenly synchronized with the 1879 distress call. The entity wasn't just replaying the house's past, it was somehow finding the resonance within her, using her own emotional history as a secondary echo chamber. Elara felt the house shift its focus. She was no longer just an observer. She was emotionally compromised, a perfect tuning fork for the manor's trapped agony. A new sound layered over the ambient silence, something the microphones didn't capture, a soft, shallow whisper. It was dry, like old leaves scraping together, and it seemed to come from the thick, smoke-stained plaster of the walls, directly behind the panel. La. The whisper grated, using the wrong cadence, stretching the syllables unnaturally. It wasn't the voice of her mother, or the governess, or the cook. It was a synthesized sound, constructed from the house's internal material, using her name. Tonight, they used her own voice. Tonight, they used her own voice. Elara scrambled backward, knocking over a tripod. She pressed her back against the damp brick, trying to disappear into the very structure she was meant to be studying. No, she croaked, the sound swallowed immediately by the thick air. It's just the old pipes, the ventilation. The whispers intensified, not forming words now, but a sound of panicked, shallow breathing, trapped and close. She pulled up the thermal image feed on her laptop. The screen showed the room in a dull spectrum of blues and purples. The levers were bright yellow, hot from their brief movement. But in the middle of the room, right where her table sat, a shape began to emerge. It was a transient, low-level thermal signature, vaguely humanoid, standing exactly where a servant would have been standing while answering. Bell 10. The shape faded almost instantly, but not before the camera recorded it. Elara's breath was coming in ragged gasps. She looked back at the ledger, desperate for the logic of the schedule to save her from the fear of the personal. The schedule offered no safety, 3:11 a.m., the beginning of chaos. Bell's 3 drawing room and 8 family parlor rings simultaneously. No clear instruction. Staff confusion suspected. Simultaneous calls. 2 levers, 2 bells, 2 different timbres of brass, all demanding attention at the same moment. It represented the complete breakdown of the strict household order. Elara felt the truth solidify. The ringing was not just a recording. It was a reenactment of the terror of the staff caught between their duty and the clear sign of imminent, chaotic danger. They had been trapped in the ritual, bound by their need to answer the bell, even as the house began to turn against them. As 3:11 a.m. arrived, the sound was catastrophic. Bell 3 deep, resonant, and bell 8 tinny, urgent clashed into a metallic shriek. Both levers dropped with sickening force. The auditory chaos was disorienting, and Elara shut her eyes, imagining the panicked servants, the young footman, the aging butler, the terrified cook caught between the competing demands of the elite and the growing physical threat of the fire that was surely starting in this very room. The servants' hall. She opened her eyes and looked at the ledger, tracing the entry for bell 8, the family parlor. She noticed a faint, almost microscopic indentation on the parchment, right next to the number. It was a single, perfect fingerprint. Elara grabbed her high-powered magnifier and brought it to the ledger. Yes, an antique ink-smudged print. She looked at her own hands, pale and clean, then back at the relic. The partial truth enough to change everything, but not enough to feel safe dawned on her. The calls were not emanating from a general pool of psychic energy. They were being actively pulled by the trapped consciousnesses of the victims, stuck in the perpetual moment of their final, panicked duty. The world outside the beam of her lead lamp seemed to contract. The immense manor felt suddenly like a small, suffocating box. The silence that followed the twin clangs was not empty. It was heavy, filled with the presence of trapped, invisible entities moving through the dark, fulfilling their final, fatal assignments. Elara felt a wave of profound sorrow. She no longer feared the bells because they signaled an external threat. She feared them because they were the sound of loyalty leading to death. She pitied the servants who, in their terror, still obeyed the schedule. She saw the parallel in her own life, her rigid schedule, her professional detachment, her refusal to acknowledge the emotional reality of her past. Her armor of logic was slowly dissolving, making her vulnerable to the house's specific brand of trauma. She looked at the thermal camera again. The faint shape was gone, but the cooling brass levers emitted a residual heat that lingered. She saw her own hands on the laptop keyboard, the hands of the meticulous historian. She felt the chill of the cement floor soaking through her clothes, the reality of her present. And then she heard the whisper again, closer now, coming from the air directly in front of her. It wasn't her name this time. It was a desperate, choking sound, like someone trying to spit out ash. And then a single, clear word, spoken in a voice that was utterly defeated, utterly heartbroken. Mistake. The word hung in the air. Mistake. Was it the cook, realizing the fire was too much? The valet, seeing the master's intentions? Or was it directed at Elara herself, the ultimate mistake being her presence in this collapsing timeline? She snatched up the staff duties ledger, flipping forward past the 3:12 a.m. section, which was smudged and illegible. She kept going, desperately seeking a post-fire entry, a note on the aftermath, a record of the morning after. Nothing. The book ended at 3:11 a.m. The history ended with the last frantic signals. She realized the deeper horror. The house wasn't just replaying the events. It was trapped in the expectation of the next moment. The space between 3:11 a.m. and 3:12 a.m. was the most dangerous moment. The final, agonizing wait for the inevitable. The house was breathing in, and she knew the exhale would be fire and the final, screaming bell. Elara stood up, feeling wobbly and sick. The air felt thick, difficult to move through, as if the oxygen was being drawn away by the intensifying psychic exertion. She had to break the pattern. She had to interfere. She was standing next to the fireplace, a huge, sooty mouth of stone. She grabbed a rusted poker lying nearby, its metal cold and heavy. Her intention was simple: destroy the panel, stop the clock, end the cycle. She raised the poker, her arms trembling. The reflection of the LED lamp on the brass panel seemed to pulse, beckoning her closer. She saw the 6 levers that were down, a physical representation of the servants who had already been called to their doom. Bells 7, 4, 9, 5, 2, 3, 8. All answers given before she could strike. The clock ticked over to the most pivotal moment in the house's recorded history, 3:12 a.m. But it was silent. The house held its breath. The final emergency bell 1. The front entry emergency bell did not ring. The chaos did not erupt. The fire did not start. Instead, there was an unnatural, oppressive lull. The profound silence was more terrifying than the metallic shrieks of the combined bells. The performance had paused, waiting for the audience to understand the final, agonizing truth. The waiting itself was the climax. Elara lowered the poker, her muscles trembling from the aborted action, staring at the motionless brass panel, realizing the house had one last, terrible revelation it intended to share before the final curtain fell. The panic was over. The lesson was about to begin. The profound silence at 3:12 a.m. was a vacuum of terror. It was not the absence of sound, but the suffocating pressure of sound withheld. Elara stood with the rusted poker clutched in her hand, breathing shallowly, her eyes fixed on the servant call system. Bell 1, the front entry emergency bell, the last remaining signal, the one that should have screamed the arrival of the fire, remained motionless. The schedule, so meticulously followed for the last 12 minutes, had shattered at its most critical juncture. Elara was past fatigue. She was running on a cold, brittle edge of adrenaline and realization. The lack of the final bell meant one of two things: either the schedule was incomplete, or the final emergency call was never answered, or worse, was never intended to be answered. The latter possibility, born of the mistake whispered in the dark, was a chilling prospect. She moved toward the panel, dropping the poker. It clattered loudly on the stone floor, the sound echoing sickeningly in the oppressive silence. She reached out and touched the lever for bell 1. Unlike the other 6, which were locked in the down position and impossibly cold, this one was neutral. It was warm from the residual heat of the surrounding metal, and it moved freely when she pushed it slightly. It was ready to be pulled, driven by a historian's need to fill a black hole of data, and perhaps a desperate need to end the unbearable silence. Elara reached for the ledger one last time. She flipped to the last recorded page, the one where the 3:12 a.m. entry was obscured by the deep, smudged ink blot. She placed her phone's light directly over the mark, angling the beam, desperately seeking the texture of the original parchment beneath the blot. She saw it, faint, hurried, but discernible through the thinning ink, the original entry, hastily written and then violently crossed out, right next to the designation for bell 1 emergency. The sight of the script sent a final, shattering shockwave through her body. The entry did not read alert fire or call brigade. It read, 3:12 a.m., bell 1 emergency. Lord B instructs immediate family departure. Staff to remain. The house hadn't burned by accident. It hadn't been an uncontrolled gas lamp fire. The final, desperate call was not for help, but for betrayal. Lord Blackwood had used the emergency bell system to ensure his family's escape, simultaneously sealing the fate of the servants trapped in the lower hall, where the fire was intentionally started. The chaos of 3:11 a.m., bells 3 and 8 simultaneously, was the moment the staff realized the order was contradictory and fatal. The final bell, bell 1, didn't ring because the staff, realizing the truth, refused to answer it. The panic was over, replaced by a final, fatal defiance. Elara looked back at the panel, no longer seeing a historical artifact, but a gallows. The 6 depressed levers represented the 6 servants who had answered the call to valet, the cook, the scullery maid, the housekeeper, the butler. The parlor made their duty, leading them directly into the flames. They had been trapped by their loyalty, and the house was forcing her to witness their final realization, As she stared at the silent, expectant bell 1, Elara felt the house's emotional temperature spike to an unbearable level. It was not the cold of the dead. It was the heat of injustice, the raw, unquenchable anger of the betrayed. She lifted her eyes from the panel, her gaze naturally drifting to her own reflection in the highly polished brass. The brass, still faintly warm from the previous bell's movements, mirrored her face perfectly. But in the polished surface, her features were contorted, stretched thin by a terrified, wide-eyed scream. She wasn't just seeing her fear. She was seeing the face of someone realizing their doom. Then, the final, terrifying confrontation occurred. She didn't see a ghost. She saw the reflection of the cook, the shadow that had moved with bell 4, standing directly behind her in the brass surface. The figure was transparent, ephemeral, but its expression of absolute, vacant horror was clear. The cook's eyes, wide and hollow, were fixed not on Elara, but on the lever for bell 1. The shadow moved its mouth. It was a silent movement, but Elara felt the dry, cold air against the back of her neck, and heard the whisper, closer and clearer than before. It was a single, ragged, almost soundless utterance, a final, desperate plea, delivered not to the master, but to her, the historian who had uncovered their truth. "Hear me." The sound faded, and the reflection of the cook vanished. Elara was left with her own screaming reflection in the brass, the raw terror of the moment imprinted on her features. She realized the ultimate horror. The house didn't want to frighten her. It wanted her to listen to the schedule, to understand the truth of the betrayal, and to carry the testimony. She stumbled backward, landing against the cold stone of the fireplace hearth. She closed her eyes, trying to purge the image of the cook's eyes from her mind, trying to silence the profound, ringing silence of the unanswered bell 1. The silence broke one last time. It was not a bell. It was not a whisper of her name. It was the soft, almost maternal sound of someone carefully, deliberately, pushing a chair back from a wooden table. The sound came from the center of the hall, where the table had been in 1879, right near the panel. It was the sound of the cook rising, not to answer a call, but to acknowledge the final, damning instruction the staff to remain. Elara opened her eyes, staring at the empty, dust-filled spot where the sound originated. She finally understood the deepest layer of the haunting. The bells were a cry for justice, the schedule a preserved timeline of a crime, and she, the meticulous historian, had been drawn into the role of the final, uninvited witness. She stood up slowly, her body numb, and looked at the ledger, then at the panel, and finally at the main servant's staircase, which spiraled up into the darkness towards the master's suite. The compulsion to flee was gone. She felt, instead, an absolute, empty clarity. She knew everything. She picked up her tablet. Her hands were steady. She began typing, not architectural notes, but a summary of the events, starting with the 3 knocks, ending with the betrayal in the ledger. She was documenting the haunting itself, fulfilling her final, involuntary duty. The room was still waiting. Elara looked at her reflection in the dark, cold screen of her tablet, watching her eyes as they absorbed the overwhelming weight of the truth. She heard a final, almost imperceptible sound, a dry intake of breath, like a sigh of resignation. Right beside her, she lowered the tablet slowly, her gaze fixed on the spot where the sound seemed to linger. And that's when she realized the whisper wasn't asking her to hear the servant's plight, or call her name. It was practicing it. And that's when she realized the whisper wasn't calling her name. It was practicing it.